So here we are in Unit 5, and we're going to talk about execution. Now, we finished the project plan, and at the end of the project plan phase, what do we have? Well, we should have leadership commitment and blessing for what it is we're going to do. We should have an idea of what steps we're going to follow in the project plan, who is going to do what resources are necessary, what some key milestones are, and kind of where we think the project plan might have its biggest challenges. And so the ability to sort of anticipate the risks and execution issues that might face us is a very important part of the planning process. It's not just the mechanical exercise. The mechanics itself actually can stir a lot of great dialogue, and so it's sort of necessary, but not sufficient. We do have a lot of hope and faith that the project's going to be successful, and a lot of hard work in front of us when we're done with planning. I will say that the gut check at the end of the planning phase is something that's important to do with each one of the team members you work with. And everybody's got to sort of believe that the plan is doable and executable as it currently stands. It's got to be the team's plan, not any individual's plan. And sometimes that takes some work and candid conversation to make happen. Now, during execution, and again, this could take days, weeks, months, years, the questions that we as managers need to be asking are things like what I've listed here. You know, are we progressing towards the goal as planned? Are we on plan? So, if you go down the list of each of the tasks and activities and you look at the timeline, it's important to know whether you're getting the work done you said you'd get done, that you are consuming roughly the amount of resources you thought you would assume, and you're roughly on schedule. The second part is the plan still appropriate to achieve my goals? It's not that uncommon for a plan to be successfully executed, and yet you kind of miss the mark. You don't achieve the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And oftentimes, as you get deeper and deeper into a project, you're able to spot things that were missed early on, or things that might have been, sort of over engineered and overdone in the plan. And so you've got the gaps and you've got the yeah, other insights that you can only get from actually doing the work. The third piece is, do I actually know where I am against the plan? So, having managed projects of anywhere from 3 to 300 people myself, I know sometimes I think I know where the team is at, but I get surprised. So, a lot of times in projects, the dynamic is, hey, I'm going to say that I'm on track, even though I don't think I'm on track because I don't know how far off track I am, as an example, or I don't want to be embarrassed or something like that. And I sort of have a no surprise rule in management. I never get angry or take any action when somebody makes a mistake and comes to me proactively and says, "Hey, this isn't working out the way we had thought it would." I do tend to be more aggressive as a manager when something that a team member knew about the project being off course is held back from me for days, weeks, and months. So um, I suggest that that's a good balance that we as any manager should have is, they might not want to bring you good news. I'm sorry, they may not want to bring you bad news and only give you good news, but you've got to react the right way when they bring you bad news for that information to flow. The fourth question here is, am I promptly identifying issues and appropriately resolving them? Of course, I just addressed that by saying, if the team doesn't bring issues to you as a manager and you're not seeing them yourself, they can exist, and it's pretty hard to resolve an issue you don't know about. And it's very critical to make sure that issues are well tracked, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last thing is, are the assumptions being made across the project consistent with one another? So as projects get bigger and bigger, you often find that people are doing really good work, but they've made a set of assumptions that might be incongruous with the assumptions that other people have made. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And that's a good topic for the group conversations and discussions with the people attending your course. Now, this is a very busy slide. It's actually sort of an example of the patient intake project that I had mentioned in one of the earlier modules. And as you can see, I'll give you a quick walkthrough. It's a project that's estimated in weeks. We have a work breakdown structure at 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of detail, at least for these first couple phases. We have an estimate of what the effort that has been spent to date is, so how much work people have done. And we have an estimate that was in the plan. And so we can compare kind of what we've already spent to date versus what we had in the plan. And in doing that, we can start to estimate what it's going to take to complete the activity if it's not done yet. And then we can figure out after completing the activity, are we over or under budget, which is what we see here in red. That this prepare the survey, we assumed it was going to be 8 hours of effort, 8 hours of work. Again, that might be 4 people, 2 hours, or 2 people, 4 hours apiece, or whatever combination gets you to that. But we find out in execution that actually it's going to take a little bit more effort to get the survey ready, and it's going to be 12. So we're going to be a little bit over. So it's a very important aspect of project planning and tracking. And, again, I'm going to focus a bit more on the mechanistic pieces of the project plan, but I want to point out that these are tools for the strong manager. These are not, uh, this is not the be all end all of managers. I've known managers that, just focus on the plan and the measurement against plan, and they're not the most effective leaders. So this is a tool for a manager, but by no means am I talking just about management here. So this first task here, A, is behind schedule, right? We thought it would be done at the end of week 1. Here we are in week 2, right? That's where today is on the plan. And it's not done, right? And so we know it's off schedule, but we also know it's over budget. It's going to take more work. Now, sometimes work isn't over budget, but it's behind schedule. So lots of things can happen there. So another one came in under budget, right? Identify people to survey. We thought that was going to take 16. We've already spent 12 hours doing that, but the team thinks it's only going to take 2 hours to finish it. And so we're going to gain a couple hours back over here. So that's good news. And again, we have to be in the practice on the work plan of collecting people's feedback and saying, do you think it's going to be more or less work than the plan to finish the activity? And again, we don't want to penalize them if things are taking longer because we want to know that information proactively. Now, there very may well be things that they could do to be more productive, and we can help them do that. That's part of our job as managers as well. But we need to get them in the practice of telling us, okay, what is it going to take relative to what we thought in the plan it would take, and how's the best way to kind of manage that issue. Now, here's an example of a task that is receive responses and summarize the results. And we originally thought it was going to take 40, but now we're estimating that it's going to take 50. And we haven't even started it yet. So how could you know something's going to take longer and take more time? I should say take more time, not necessarily longer, before you've even started it. And that's because you're gaining insight. Perhaps the survey is just frankly longer. Or it's going to go out to more people than you thought it was going to go to, or something like that, right? So anticipatory project management says you don't wait to be over budget, or you don't wait to be behind schedule. You can see some of this stuff in advance, and that's a trait of a strong project manager and a strong team, quite frankly. Um, so, we also have to question the information on the plan, which is point D here. So if you look, the survey isn't done. So how could we have been doing work involved with sending the survey out? Is this really feasible to have spent half of our effort, 12 of the 24 hours, and the survey is not even done yet? So how could we have spent half that time? Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's something that, as a manager, this is a tool that's going to help me figure out whether, in fact, this is still going to be on budget and has a chance of being on schedule, um, even though the team members involved with this activity are still reporting that it's going to be on budget and on time. The last point I'm going to cover on this slide, and again, this is very dense, so when you're conducting this, it's obviously something you want to have paper copies in front of everybody and spend a good deal of time on it because it's the most tangible example I've created for this course. But I like to do surveys, and I like to ask people how how they feel the project is going overall. And I'm going to ask you guys this now. When you look at this project plan, is it going great? Is it pure green? Is it going poorly? Is it an absolute disaster yet? How would you rate it? But I also mean this as to be a bit of a tool. I used to ask one of my projects to put smiley faces on their cubicles or on their desks and just, if they were really happy, put a happy smiley face. If they were really unhappy and grumpy, put that on their desk. And if they were somewhere in the middle, put that on their desk. And very quickly, I could go around and see the signs on people's desks and realize how they thought about how the project was actually going. Now, deviations from the plan can be around schedule. So we could just be behind schedule. We thought something was going to take 3 months, and we now think it's going to be 4 or 5 months. They can be around resources, where we think it was going to take, 1,000 shillings, but it might take 1,500 shillings to get something done. It might be about scope. It might be that we forgot about something really important when we developed the project plan, and we have a question of whether we should add it to the project plan, which might impact both schedule and resources. And we also have deviations in terms of risk. We might have assumed that there was a certain level of risk when we did the planning phase, but as we get into execution, we've got to start to address that risk. So these are all the different deviations from plan, and they can be both positive and negative. My experience is that they're probably on average more negative than positive because we're often a little bit more optimistic in planning than the real world turns out to be. But the key point here is that it's really important to be proactive, right? You have choices that you as managers can make, and you can, uh, kind of as a team or as a governance body, figure out what you're going to do. So if you find yourself behind schedule, you might be able to add resources, have more people help to get the job done on time. If you're behind on schedule, you could also cut some scope. You could say take some things out of scope and get the project done on time because you cut scope. If you're over on resources, you can decide similarly to cut scope, but sometimes you might just decide to elongate the project and not have to add resource, but just let the project take longer ultimately. And those are the examples I'll use right now. But again, this is a really good topic to get into with the attendees. A very concrete example of a case that I was on, um, and I took the details out of this, but this will be useful, I hope, to think about, is a project that I was on that was going to be 4 weeks late and be over budget in terms of both money and work effort. So 4 weeks out of what was a 16-week project roughly, was a pretty sizable overage in terms of schedule, and it was roughly going to cost about 25% more money and budget. And so, nobody was very happy. And we sat down, and when I mentioned governance, governance is really just the process of making decisions. But we sat down with our steering committee and we presented some options, right? And this is the mark of, I think, what a good leader would do is to think about and have credible options, of things that the governance bodies can choose from to uh, configure the bad news to the extent of their priorities or in line with their priorities. So option one was, hey, let's just accept the overages and let the schedule skip 4 weeks and spend the additional money to do the project. So that was sort of the default. The second one was, hey, as I mentioned earlier, we were going to say cut scope. In our case, it meant doing fewer interviews with key stakeholders to keep the project on plan, and we could minimize some of the financial overages. Now, that's not free, right? That was going to maybe impact the quality of the findings of our project. But the question was, is that additional risk that we were willing to take? The third option was to add even more resources, which would cost even more money, but get the project done in the full scope and within the original date. So the client would agree to add resource, and we would basically add people to get the work done, that 4 weeks of additional work done in the original project plan. So you can imagine this was a very active debate amongst management, and different members of management had different preferences as to which options were there. And this is what governance is all about, right? It's the process of sorting this through these divergent priorities. And so, the governance, as I mentioned, is the mechanism by which important decisions are made. There's a tendency to have too much centralized control, a king or queen of the project who gets to decide everything. That isn't the best way to get people motivated. But it can also be too decentralized, where everyone makes whatever decisions they want to make, and that can be a pretty dysfunctional project. So the ability to identify this as a decision that has to be made, and it has to be made collectively, is pretty key. Now, I mentioned these steering committees, and the key there is you want to have it to be large enough that the key stakeholders are represented. But quite frankly, without insulting anybody, you want to keep the steering committee as small as possible for it to be effective. There's a lot of research and frankly practical experience that we have as managers that says, hey, people are more willing to approach uncomfortable topics, the smaller the group that's in the room. And you add people, you tend to get people being a little quieter and not sharing sometimes what they really think. So project execution is for many the most fun, and it is clearly how you learn more about planning. After you've developed the plan, having to execute it is what teaches you a lot. And I don't think planners are managers. I've met people who talked about the fact that they were project managers because they were really good at managing the mechanics of the plan. But I actually think that's necessary, but again, not sufficient to be an effective manager. And in a live conduct